How the dollar became a weapon. No missiles crossed the border and no soldiers marched into the capital. There was no declaration of war, no emergency speech, no moment the world could point to and say this is when it began. And yet, within days, the economy started to suffocate. Payments slowed, banks hesitated, contracts were quietly suspended, not because anyone was ordered to stop, but because uncertainty spreads faster than regulation. One institution paused a transfer, another followed, and soon the safest decision inside the system became inaction. In a world built on constant movement, inaction is not neutrality, it is collapse. This is how modern power operates, not through explosions or occupation, but through hesitation, through delays that feel temporary at first, rational even, a missing confirmation, an unanswered email, a compliance review that takes longer than expected. None of these actions look aggressive in isolation, but together they form pressure. And pressure does not need noise to be effective. Silence does the job more efficiently. For decades, the US dollar was treated as something neutral, just money, a tool that made global trade easier, faster, more predictable. It did not look like control, it looked like convenience. Oil was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. Reserves were stored in dollars. Companies accounted in dollars. Nations planned budgets around it. At first, this felt like stability, a shared language for an interconnected world, something everyone used because everyone else already did. But stability can also create dependency. And dependency, when it goes unquestioned for long enough, quietly turns into leverage. No country ever voted for this system. There was no global agreement signed by citizens. No referendum asked whether the world wanted one currency to sit at the center of trade, finance, and reserves. It simply became normal, and once something becomes normal, questioning it feels radical. The system stops being seen as a choice and starts being treated as infrastructure. Invisible, unavoidable, untouchable. The moment the dollar stopped being optional, it stopped being just a currency. It became the plumbing of the global economy, the pipes through which value moves. And when access to those pipes is even slightly threatened, panic does not begin in governments. It begins in boardrooms, in legal departments, in risk committees, in banks that would rather overreact than be exposed. No official needs to announce a ban. No public order is required. The system whispers instead. Risk models flash warnings. Insurance coverage becomes uncertain. Clearing times extend. Suddenly, every transaction feels heavier, slower, more dangerous, and at that point the decision is no longer political. It is existential. This is the part most people misunderstand. There is rarely a single command. No one stands at the center pulling a lever labeled collapse. Power today works through anticipation, through the fear of consequences before they are even defined. Companies do not wait to be punished. They retreat early. Banks do not wait to be blamed. They freeze first and explain later. What looks like voluntary compliance is often preemptive self-preservation. And that is what makes the system so effective. Responsibility dissolves. Every actor can point elsewhere. Regulators blame markets. Markets blame risk. Banks blame rules. Rules blame uncertainty. And in the middle of that chain, economies slow down without anyone technically pulling the trigger. At this stage, nothing has exploded yet. Nothing has officially broken. From the outside, the system still appears intact. But inside, something fundamental has shifted. Access is no longer guaranteed. Movement is no longer automatic. And once doubt enters a system built on trust, it does not leave quietly. This is not the story of a currency losing value. It is the story of a currency gaining power. And power, once embedded into infrastructure, does not need to announce itself to be felt. The dollar did not become powerful overnight. It was never introduced as a weapon, and it was not designed to dominate. Its rise began as a solution to chaos. After global wars and broken currencies, the world needed something that could be trusted more than promises and less than ideology. The dollar filled that vacuum not because it was perfect, but because it was available, liquid, and backed by a system that appeared stable enough to carry the weight of global trade. At first, the arrangement felt practical. Countries could trade without constantly renegotiating exchange mechanisms. Corporations could price goods without worrying about wild currency swings. Banks could settle transactions through a shared framework. The dollar became the default, not through force but through repetition. The more it was used, the safer it seemed, and the safer it seemed, the more it was used. This is how lock-in works, not through obligation, but through habit. Once global trade normalized around the dollar, alternatives stopped being developed with urgency. Why invest in parallel systems when the existing one worked? Why question a structure that delivered growth, predictability, and access to capital? Over time, dependence was no longer noticed because the benefits were immediate and the risks were abstract. The cost of leaving the system felt higher than the cost of staying inside it. As this dependence deepened, the dollar stopped being just a medium of exchange. It became a unit of account for global reality itself. Commodities were priced in it, contracts referenced it, debt obligations assumed its availability. Even countries that publicly criticized the system quietly organized their reserves around it, not because they agreed with its politics, but because exiting it would mean isolation. And isolation, in a globalized economy, is not a theoretical problem, it is immediate and measurable. What made this system especially resilient was that it did not rely on constant enforcement. It relied on incentives, access to capital markets, lower borrowing costs, easier settlement. Participation came with rewards, and compliance felt voluntary. The system did not need to threaten exclusion. The fear of exclusion was enough. Over time, institutions adapted themselves around this reality. Banks optimized operations for dollar clearing. Financial infrastructure grew around US-based systems. Legal frameworks assumed dollar settlement as standard. Even non-American entities built their internal processes to align with dollar-centric rules because deviating from them introduced friction. And friction, in finance, is treated as risk. This is where the shift becomes critical. When a currency becomes infrastructure, it stops behaving like a neutral tool. Infrastructure shapes behavior. Roads determine where cities grow. Networks determine who can connect. And financial infrastructure determines who can participate. Once the dollar reached that stage, access mattered more than price. Being inside the system mattered more than the cost of using it. At this point, power did not need to be exercised aggressively. It existed passively, embedded in clearing mechanisms, correspondent banking relationships, settlement timelines, and compliance standards. Any entity that touched the dollar, even indirectly, became subject to the logic of the system that governed it. And because the system was global, its reach extended far beyond borders. A transaction between two non-American entities could still pass through dollar channels. A deal made on another continent could still depend on US-based financial infrastructure to clear. Geography became irrelevant. Exposure became universal. This is the moment when neutrality began to fade. Not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. The rules that governed access were no longer purely technical. They started reflecting political priorities, regulatory expectations, and strategic interests. And once rules reflect interests, enforcement becomes selective, even if it appears consistent on paper. Most participants did not resist this shift. They adjusted. They updated compliance manuals. They hired risk officers. They accepted that access now came with conditions, even if those conditions were not always explicitly stated. What mattered was staying connected, because in a system built around a single financial backbone, disconnection is not punishment, it is disappearance. By the time the world started questioning whether the dollar could be used as leverage, the answer was already embedded in the system. The mechanisms were in place, the dependencies were locked, and the cost of defiance had quietly become unbearable. The transformation from currency to weapon did not happen with a single announcement. There was no moment when the world woke up and realized the rules had changed. Instead, the shift revealed itself through behavior, through patterns that repeated often enough to become predictable, through reactions that spread faster than any formal policy ever could. When access to the dollar-based system becomes uncertain, the first response is rarely defiance, it is caution. Banks begin asking more questions. Transactions that once cleared automatically are flagged for review. Settlement times stretch. Not because the system has officially closed its doors, but because no one wants to be the institution that ignored a warning sign. In modern finance, being wrong is less dangerous than being exposed. This is where the real power emerges, not in laws, but in incentives, not in punishment, but in anticipation. Financial institutions are not waiting to be told what to do. They are constantly calculating what might happen if they do nothing. And when the perceived cost of participation outweighs the benefit, retreat feels rational. One by one, actors step back, each convinced they are making an independent decision. But independence is an illusion when everyone is responding to the same signals. Payment networks slow. Correspondent banks reassess relationships. Insurance coverage becomes uncertain. Credit lines tighten. None of this requires a coordinated order. The system enforces itself. Compliance departments become the front line. Legal teams interpret risk broadly. Executives prioritize survival over opportunity. What appears from the outside as political pressure is, internally, framed as risk management. This is why modern sanctions rarely look like blockades. They look like paperwork. They arrive as emails, policy updates, revised guidelines. They move quietly through institutions that are already conditioned to avoid friction at all costs. And because these institutions sit at the center of global finance, their choices ripple outward, affecting companies, governments, and entire populations that never interacted with the original decision. At this stage, the weapon does not need to be fired. The knowledge that it exists is enough. Markets react before policies fully take effect. Companies suspend operations before restrictions are finalized. Investors pull back not because outcomes are certain, but because uncertainty itself is unacceptable. Capital does not wait for clarity, it moves away from risk. What makes this mechanism so effective is the absence of a single point of accountability. There is no general issuing commands, no visible authority forcing compliance. Every participant can claim they are simply following rules, protecting shareholders, or adhering to best practices. Responsibility dissolves across the system, and because no one actor appears to be in control, resistance becomes almost impossible to organize. Even governments struggle to counter this dynamic. Political leaders may issue statements, but statements do not clear payments. Sovereignty does not process transactions. Without access to the underlying financial infrastructure, authority becomes symbolic. Decisions still need to move through banks, through insurers, through settlement systems that operate according to their own logic. This is where the dollar's role becomes undeniable. Because it sits at the center of this infrastructure, it inherits the power of everything built around it. Any entity that relies on dollar settlement, even indirectly, becomes subject to the system's gravitational pull. Opting out is not a switch that can be flipped. It is a process that carries immediate costs and uncertain outcomes. Attempts to bypass the system often reveal how deeply embedded it is. Alternative payment channels lack scale. Parallel networks struggle with trust. Liquidity is thinner, transaction costs rise. What once felt like autonomy begins to resemble isolation. And isolation, in a world dependent on global flows, is destabilizing. Over time, this dynamic reshapes behavior. States adjust foreign policy calculations. Corporations reconsider supply chains. Banks redefine acceptable exposure. The weapon does not need to be brandished openly. Its influence is felt through absence, through what cannot be done, through deals that never happen, through growth that never materializes. This is not coercion in the traditional sense. There are no ultimatums, no countdowns, just a narrowing of options until the remaining path feels inevitable. And when outcomes feel inevitable, resistance fades quietly. The dollar did not need to conquer. It only needed to sit at the center while the system learned to protect itself. And once a system learns to do that, it becomes far more effective than any command structure ever could. Once a system reaches this stage, the question is no longer how powerful it is. The question becomes how long it can remain that way. Power embedded in infrastructure feels permanent, but history suggests otherwise. Every system that appears unavoidable eventually invites pressure, not always from open resistance, but from quiet adaptation. In recent years, the language around the dollar has begun to change. Not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly. Discussions about alternatives surface more often. Bilateral trade agreements experiment with local currencies. Regional payment systems are proposed. Digital settlement frameworks are tested. None of these initiatives threaten the system on their own. In fact, most of them fail quietly. But their existence signals something important. Awareness. Once participants recognize that infrastructure is not neutral, trust begins to shift, not collapse, but adjust. States start hedging rather than committing. Institutions diversify exposure rather than relying on a single channel. Even allies begin preparing contingencies, not because they plan to exit, but because they no longer assume access is unconditional. This is where the weapon creates its own paradox. The more effectively it is used, the more visible it becomes. And the more visible it becomes, the more participants question whether dependence is worth the risk. Power that relies on invisibility works best when it is not acknowledged. Once it is openly discussed, it begins to shape behavior in unintended ways. But alternatives come with costs. Parallel systems lack depth. Liquidity does not migrate easily. Trust cannot be engineered overnight. Financial ecosystems grow through repetition and reliability, not declarations. For now, the dollar remains dominant, not because there are no substitutes, but because substitutes are incomplete. Fragmentation introduces friction, and friction slows growth. Most actors still choose efficiency over autonomy. Yet the question lingers beneath every transaction. What happens when access is no longer assumed? What happens when political alignment becomes a condition for financial participation? At what point does risk management turn into strategic vulnerability? These are not academic concerns. They shape long-term decisions. Investment horizons shorten. Supply chains are redesigned. Reserves are adjusted quietly, incrementally. No headlines announce these shifts. They unfold slowly, almost invisibly, just as the system itself once did. The future of this mechanism does not hinge on a dramatic collapse. It hinges on accumulation, on small adjustments made by many actors over time, on hedges that become habits, on backups that evolve into preferences. Infrastructure does not disappear suddenly. It erodes gradually, as confidence diffuses. And yet, for now, the system holds. The dollar still clears. Payments still flow. Markets still react. Most of the world continues to operate within the same framework because stepping outside it remains costly. The weapon still works, precisely because it does not need to be used constantly. Its presence shapes decisions before action is required. This leaves us with an uncomfortable reality. The most effective forms of power today do not announce themselves. They do not conquer territory or raise flags. They design environments where choices narrow naturally, where participation feels voluntary until it isn't, where silence replaces force. The dollar did not become a weapon because someone decided to use it that way. It became a weapon because the world built everything around it. And once something sits at the center of movement, controlling access to it reshapes behavior without ever appearing to do so. The question is not whether this system is fair. Fairness is irrelevant to infrastructure. The question is whether it is sustainable, whether a global system can remain stable when access doubles as leverage, whether trust can coexist with conditional participation. Those answers are not clear yet. They may not be visible for years, But the mechanism is already in motion, quietly influencing decisions, quietly redefining power, quietly reminding everyone that in a connected world, the strongest weapon is not force, it is dependence. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to follow and subscribe.